The air in the arena was comfortable. It was, for the first time in years, settled. The long, oppressive reign was over. The story was finished. The new champion stood in the ring, his voice echoing with a familiar, triumphant cadence, speaking of the future, of a new beginning. The crowd, bathed in the energetic blue lights of SmackDown, was relaxed, participating in the shared joy of a new era. They were celebrating the end of something. They believed the war was over, that the tyrant was gone, and that wrestling could finally breathe again. It was a normal Friday night. And then, it wasn't. It started not with a sound, but with an absence of sound. A sudden sharp click echoed through the PA system, a noise so mundane it was terrifying, and then total blackness. Not a fade, but a void. The champion's microphone cut out. The Titantron died. The blue lights vanished. The only sound was a collective, unified gasp from 20,000 people. A nervous murmur rippled through the darkness. This wasn't part of the show. This felt different. This felt cold. The seconds stretched into an eternity. People's eyes adjusted, revealing only the faint red glow of the on-air cameras, like tiny demonic eyes watching from the void. The anxiety in the building became a physical presence, a heavy blanket of dread. Something was wrong. The peace had been a lie. The story wasn't over. The lights didn't rise. They snapped back on. Not the vibrant blue of before, but a harsh, sterile, blinding white. And he was there. No music, no grand entrance, no acknowledgement. He was just standing. In the center of the ring, in a black hoodie and cargo pants, stood Roman Reigns. The champion hadn't even turned around. He felt the atmosphere shift before he saw him, the sudden drop in temperature, the silence of the crowd. He turned, slowly, and his face, it wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was a profound, hollow shock, the look of a man seeing a ghost. For 3 full seconds, the arena was utterly silent. You could hear the hum of the ballast in the white lights. Then the sound came. It wasn't a cheer. It wasn't a boo. It was a roar of confusion, a primal scream of disbelief. People were standing, hands on their heads, mouths agape. Cameras flashed, tiny explosions trying to capture a moment that felt impossible. Roman hadn't moved. He just stood there, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He looked thinner, weary, but his eyes were heavier. They burned with an intensity that the television cameras could never truly capture. He was a monument to an era everyone was trying to forget, standing in the middle of their celebration. The show, the script, the future, all of it stopped. Time itself had just been acknowledged. While the arena was frozen, the backstage area, the place called Gorilla, was pure chaos. Producers and executives were screaming into headsets. "Who cleared him? Is this planned? Cut the feed!" But no one cut the feed. They couldn't. They were as mesmerized as the audience. On a small monitor in a private suite, the new Bloodline was watching. Solo Sikoa, the man who had claimed the mantle of tribal chief, had been holding court, laughing, his bravado on full display. Now he was a statue. His hand, which had been holding a glass, had clenched so tightly, ice and liquid spilled onto the floor. He didn't notice. His entire foundation, the authority he had built with fear and violence, had just been reduced to a footnote. He was, in that single instant, exposed as a regent. The real king had just walked back into the palace. And at the announcer's desk, Paul Heyman was a study in stillness. He hadn't been brought back into the inner circle. He was an outcast, a historian, a wise man without a tribe. The camera wasn't focused on him, but a side angle caught it all. He gently took off his headset, placed it on the desk, and folded his hands. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't happy. He looked resigned. He was a man who knew deep down that his peace was temporary. The architect of the most dominant reign in history had just seen his creation return from the dead. Back in the ring, the champion finally found his breath. His knuckles were white on the microphone. He was the hero. He was the one who had won. He raised the mic to speak, to demand an answer. Before a single word could escape, Roman raised one single finger. The universal sign for one, but it meant something else entirely. It meant silence. And the champion obeyed. The man who had conquered the conqueror was reduced to silence by a simple gesture. The crowd, sensing this shift, grew quiet again. Roman began to move. He circled the champion, slowly, deliberately, like a predator inspecting his territory. He wasn't looking at the champion. He was looking at the mat. He was looking at the ropes. He was looking at the title belt on the champion's shoulder. He walked so close that their faces were inches apart. The world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. A spear, a word, a fight. Roman did nothing. He simply breathed in, a long, deep inhale, as if tasting the air of his home. Then, he let out a tiny, almost imperceptible scoff, a sound of pure disdain. He turned his back on the champion, the ultimate sign of disrespect, slipped through the ropes, and disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the very people who had celebrated his demise. He hadn't come to fight. He had come to remind. The 24 hours that followed were not a media frenzy. They were a media void. It was a moment too heavy to analyze. Every sports talk show, every wrestling podcast, every online forum, the usually loud, declarative voices were silent. Hosts just stared into their cameras, searching for words. We honestly don't know what to say. The company itself issued no statement. There was no "Roman Reigns has returned" graphic. The official YouTube clip was titled simply, "This silence was the answer." Nobody knew. This wasn't a pre-packaged return. This felt rogue. It felt real. The line between the performance and the person had dissolved. The shock wasn't just that he was back. It was how. No fire, no pyrotechnics, no grand speech about reclaiming his yard, just a cold, silent presence. It was the return of a king, not as a conqueror, but as a ghost. He had held the entire industry captive for 3 years with his voice and his power. Now he was holding it captive with his silence. The question on everyone's mind wasn't, what's next? It was a much simpler, more terrifying question. Why? Why return to a world he had already beaten? Why haunt the people who had finally moved on? Long after the arena had emptied and the cleaning crews had swept away the debris, the real meeting took place. In the bowels of the building, in a locker room reserved for the Bloodline, the new order was crumbling. Solo Sikoa, the man who had ordered the removal of his own family, was throwing chairs. The metal echoed horribly in the concrete room. Tama Tonga and Tangaloa, his enforcers, stood by, their usual menacing energy replaced with a palpable uncertainty. "He did it to us!" Solo finally roared, his voice cracking. "In our ring! He made us look weak!" This was the ultimate violation. They had worked for months to build a new regime, a more violent, unpredictable version of the old one. But Roman, in one silent appearance, had exposed them. He proved they were just children playing dress-up with their father's crown. The MFT shirts, the ruthless attacks, it was all a performance. Roman was presence. He didn't need to attack them. He just needed to be. He had planted a seed of doubt, and it was already fracturing their alliance. "What do we do, Chief?" Tama asked, and the hesitation in his voice said everything. Solo Sikoa, the self-proclaimed head of the table, stared at his reflection in a broken mirror. For the first time since his arrival, he had no answer. And what of the wise men? Paul Heyman was not in that locker room. He was not on the corporate jet. He was found much later at the hotel bar. The bar was closed, the lights were low, but the staff had left him a single glass of water. He just sat there, staring into it. For months, Heyman had been a man adrift, a survivor. He had been drafted to the other show, given a comfortable seat at the commentary desk. He was a historian, a storyteller. He looked peaceful. He was the one who had escaped the island, the one who had survived the fall of the empire. But he knew. He always knew. His bond with Roman Reigns wasn't a contract. It wasn't employment. It was a covenant. And tonight, the man he had orchestrated, the man he had advised, the man he had created, had returned. Heyman wasn't afraid of what Roman would do to him. He was afraid of what Roman would ask of him. He was afraid of himself. He was terrified that despite the peace he had found, despite the trauma and the public humiliation, a dark, small part of him was elated to see his tribal chief. That's the part that scared him most, the part that wanted to go back. We must try to understand the man. Why come back at all? Roman Reigns had achieved immortality, a reign that lasted over 1,000 days. He had defeated every legend. He had built a dynasty. He had finally been beaten. The story was complete. He was free. He had his health, his family, his legacy. Why would he step back into the fire? Why return to the very place that had cost him so much? Because the crown is heavier than the man. Because for 3 years his identity was not Joe. It was the tribal chief. It was the head of the table. When that is taken from you, when you are left alone in the silence of your own home, who are you? This return wasn't about a championship. It wasn't about revenge on the man who beat him. This was about an addict, desperate for one more taste of the power that had defined him. He was a king without a kingdom, wandering the halls of a palace that was no longer his. He didn't come back to win. He came back because he didn't know how to stop. He was a man who had forgotten how to live without the weight of the world on his shoulders. The following 7 days felt like a lifetime. The entire wrestling world held its breath, waiting for SmackDown. The company, now forced to react, promoted it simply. All parties will be in the arena. The champion was out first. No smile, no waving to the crowd. He was a man prepared for war. He called Roman out. Then the new Bloodline, Solo Sikoa, flanked by his enforcers. They didn't walk to the ring. They marched. They surrounded the champion, trapping him. A triangle of hate. Solo grabbed a microphone. "He is not your problem, champion," he seethed. "He is ours." The tension was unbearable. A 3-way war was about to begin over the soul of the company. The champion, the usurper, and the ghost. The crowd was chanting Roman's name, a nervous, desperate plea. Every camera in the building pointed at the entrance ramp, waiting for that iconic, ominous music. And then it hit. That low, orchestral bass line, the head of the table theme. The crowd erupted. But he wasn't on the ramp. The camera swung wildly, trying to find him, and it did. He was already there, walking slowly, deliberately, through the crowd, just as he had left. A shark moving through water. He walked with an unnerving, calm purpose. He didn't look at the champion in the ring. He didn't look at Solo Sikoa, who was screaming his name. He walked right past the ring, a battlefield waiting for its general, and he kept walking. He stopped at the announcer's desk. The music cut. Dead silence. Paul Heyman, who had been trying to maintain his composure, slowly stood up. He looked like a man facing his executioner. Roman stared at him. The champion, the new Bloodline. They were frozen, suddenly realizing they were irrelevant. This was the real confrontation. This was the real target. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, Roman finally spoke. His first word in months. A hoarse whisper that the microphone barely caught. Wiseman. It wasn't a question. It was a command. And then, Roman did the one thing no one expected. He didn't grab Heyman. He didn't threaten him. He didn't attack him. He simply extended his hand. Palm up, the same way he always had. Not for a microphone. Not for a championship belt. For him. In that moment, the entire world understood. This was never about the title. This was never about revenge. This was about control. The war wasn't for the throne. It was for the mind that had built the empire. Roman had returned, not to reclaim his crown, but to reclaim his architect.